All right. So with these GnRH neurons, we we the GnRH neurons are the system that is going to really target the action in the anterior pituitary gland. But the hypothalamus has neurons associated with it that actually will target a release from the posterior pituitary. And the reason that this happens is because that posterior pituitary gland will actually develop from that lower brain tissue during embryogenesis. And so, an example of a hormone that uses the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. And so, oxytocin neurons are actually produced in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, and then they are secreted or dumped into the blood system in the posterior pituitary. So these axons, the cell body is in one tissue, and the dendrites are in a completely different tissue. And so you can think of the axons here as a really long slip and slide. And so they stretch a really, really, really long way. And that is why we get such a greater and more immediate response with a hormone that is produced in the posterior pituitary, like the suckling reflexes, because the the neuron here is actually sending its hormone directly into the posterior pituitary, whereas on the anterior pituitary side, GnRH has to be produced. Then it gets shuttled into the hypophyseal portal system right here. Then it targets its cell type in the anterior pituitary. Then we get it dumped into the blood system. So there's multiple steps on the anterior pituitary side and not as many steps on the posterior side. All right, so let's switch gears and talk a little bit about endocrine control, so how hormones are controlled. And this really relies on the hormones. So hormones are controlled by hormones. And so it's important that we just make sure that we have a good definition of what a hormone is before we get started here. And so the official definition of a hormone is that it is a chemical compound produced by a gland that travels through the blood and acts on a remote tissue. So it has an effect on a target tissue. And so we rely on hormones to cause a response. Okay, so we do not, with reproduction, we do not rely fully on neural stimulation. We actually rely on hormones to cause a response. So hormones can have a stimulatory effect on a target cell or an organ, which could mean that something is upregulated or turned on. Hormones can also have an inhibitory effect on a cell or an organ where something is turned off or at least slowed down. And these target cells are going to be the cells that have a receptor for a specific hormone on it. So a target cell is going to have a receptor that is going to bind to a hormone that is in circulation. So hormones are really important, but they also cause dramatic changes in extremely small quantities. And so you guys are probably the most familiar with what a gram looks like. You've probably measured it out in ANSI 101, or you've measured it out in chemistry or biology. Hormones are actually affected in the blood system in the nanogram and the picogram range. And so these are hormones that are secreted and dumped into the blood system in really, really, really extremely small amounts, but cause huge responses. Like if we think about estradiol being produced in a female that is in standing heat, it totally changes her entire behavior. She's going to seek a male, she's going to stand for a male, her uterus is going to contract and get a lot of tone to it, the cervix is going to produce some crazy slip and slide mucus. The vagina is going to produce some mucus as well. It's just, and that estrogen is actually really, really effective in, honestly, in the picogram form down here is where our steroids are at. And so, just the take home message from this is that hormones are effective in small quantities, and with reproductive hormones, those small quantities are nanograms and picograms. So, reproductive hormones are effective because of the amount of time they stay in the system. And so, one way we measure this as scientists and producers is with the concept of a half life. And so this is similar to what you've learned about in biology, but so half-life is just the time that is required for half of the quantity of a hormone to disappear from the blood. And so once a hormone is secreted, there is some sort of response that is generated, and then the compound is degraded immediately. So these hormones don't stay in the system very long. They are secreted to be active because they're needed right then, and then they're degraded almost immediately. And so just to give you kind of a reference about this, when we do estrous synchronization in the beef cows at the university farm, one of the major hormones that we use is a prostaglandin, and specifically it's prostaglandin F2 alpha. And so we give an injection of prostaglandin F2 alpha to, if we suspect that there is corpus luteum as the dominant structure on the ovary. Because PGF2 alpha naturally comes from the uterus in the absence of a pregnancy. It lyses the CL and it makes the follicle the dominant structure on the ovary so that ovulation can take place. And so when we try to mimic this system in an estrous synchronization protocol, when we're trying to breed cows at the beef unit, we give this injection of prostaglandin F2 alpha with the hope that it's going to lyse the CL and make the follicle the dominant structure on the ovary. But we give it in a massive amount for a 12 to 1400 pound cow. We give 5 cc's per injection, and we give usually just one injection. But in terms of hormones, that's a massive amount because it's effective in picograms. But the hard part is with prostaglandins, they are metabolized really quickly. So once prostaglandin is injected into the bloodstream of the animal, it's going to travel directly to the target tissue in the ovary, elicit its response, and then the rest of it that wasn't used is going to circulate through the lungs. And once it makes one pass through the lungs, it's actually rendered inactive. And so that causes us as producers to give a massive dose to make sure that we get the effect that we need. And this is all because prostaglandins have a really, really, really short half-life. All right, so as we end here with this kind of first part of the lecture, there's some specific characteristics that our reproductive hormones have that we're going to look at more in depth. So specifically, hormones that have a reproductive target act in minutes, so very quickly. They have short half-lives. They bind to very specific receptors on their target tissue cells. And they regulate intracellular biochemical reactions. And so these are 4 important components that you should memorize because they are essential when we try to manipulate the endocrinology of a livestock animal.